What if I told you that The Mask, the wacky, over-the-top comedy that made Jim Carrey a superstar, was originally supposed to be a dark, violent horror movie? Or that Jim Carrey was almost replaced? And what if I told you his face alone saved the studio $1 million in CGI costs? That's right, The Mask is full of behind-the-scenes secrets, unexpected twists, and crazy what-if scenarios that could have completely changed the film as we know it. From Cameron Diaz auditioning over 12 times to a sequel that turned into a disaster, today we're diving deep into the untold stories of The Mask. So sit back, relax, and let's take a wild ride into the making of one of the most unbelievable movies in Hollywood history. The Mask was originally a horror movie? It's almost impossible to imagine The Mask as anything other than a hilarious Jim Carrey comedy. But believe it or not, this movie was originally supposed to be a dark, violent horror film. The film is based on Dark Horse comics, but in the original comics, The Mask isn't a mischievous prankster, it's a tool of absolute destruction. When Stanley Ipkiss puts it on, he doesn't just dance and make cartoon gags. Instead, he turns into a psychotic killer, going on a brutal rampage with axes and guns instead of oversized hammers. At first, director Chuck Russell wanted to keep the horror tone. Imagine a version of The Mask where instead of the famous Cuban Pete dance scene, Ipkiss is hunting people down in cold blood. That's the movie we almost got. But everything changed when Jim Carrey was cast. His unmatched physical comedy was too good to waste, so they completely rewrote the film into a wacky, over-the-top comedy instead. Oh, and here's a fun fact, Stanley's dog, Milo? He wasn't in the comics. The filmmakers created him just for the movie, to make Ipkiss a little more likable. If they had stuck to the original idea, The Mask could have been a horror icon instead of a comedy classic. Jim Carrey was almost replaced? Looking back, it's hard to believe, but Jim Carrey was almost not cast as Stanley Ipkiss. When director Chuck Russell suggested Carrey for the role, New Line Cinema thought he was crazy. At the time, Carrey wasn't a movie star, he was just a quirky comedian known for In Living Color. The studio wanted someone more famous, someone safer. But Russell refused to back down. He knew Carrey was the only one who could bring the role to life. In the end, New Line agreed but paid Carrey just $450,000. A fair price for an unknown actor, or so they thought. Then came Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. Practically overnight, Carrey became one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. And just a few months later, Dumb and Dumber exploded at the box office. Suddenly, his asking price skyrocketed to $7 million per movie. If New Line had waited just a few months, they wouldn't have been able to afford him. And if they had picked someone else, would The Mask have even worked? We could have had a completely different movie. Jim Carrey's face saved the studio $1 million. Jim Carrey's acting didn't just make The Mask great, it also saved the studio a fortune. Originally, the filmmakers planned to heavily rely on CGI to create Stanley Ipkiss's wacky facial expressions. The idea was to stretch his face, exaggerate his features, and make him look more like a living cartoon. But then, they saw Jim Carrey perform. They quickly realized they didn't need CGI at all, because Carrey's face was already a cartoon. His elastic expressions, wild movements, and insane ability to contort his face into impossible shapes meant that most of the effects could be done practically instead of digitally. According to Chuck Russell, the VFX team at Industrial Light and Magic calculated that by casting Jim Carrey, they saved around $1 million in CGI costs. That's right, Carrey's face alone was worth $1 million. This is why The Mask still holds up today. While many 90s movies with heavy CGI now look outdated, Jim Carrey's performance remains timeless. He wasn't just playing the character, he was the character. The Jurassic Park team used The Mask as a break? You'd think that working on Jurassic Park, one of the most groundbreaking visual effects movies ever, would be every animator's dream. But for the team at Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, it was also exhausting. After spending years perfecting ultra-realistic dinosaurs, ILM needed something completely different. Enter The Mask, a film where physics didn't matter and cartoon logic ruled. Instead of worrying about accurate skin textures or lifelike movement, they could go wild with stretchy limbs, spinning heads, and eyeballs popping out of skulls. Steve Williams, ILM's director of animation, put it best: with dinosaurs, we were limited by the laws of nature. But The Mask was pure cartooning. It was refreshing. The movie let ILM break free from realism and experiment with exaggerated, slapstick effects straight out of a Looney Tunes short. And the best part? Jim Carrey did half the work for them. His face was already cartoonish enough that they didn't need as much CGI as planned. In a way, The Mask wasn't just fun for audiences, it was a creative vacation for the same team that brought dinosaurs to life. Cameron Diaz had to audition up to 12 times. Today, Cameron Diaz is a Hollywood icon, but back in 1994? She was a complete unknown. Before The Mask, Diaz was a successful model, but she had never acted in a single movie. When she auditioned for the role of Tina Carlisle, the studio was skeptical. She had the look, but did she have the talent? They weren't convinced. As a result, Diaz had to audition between 8 and 12 times, over and over again, before finally landing the part. Even after being cast, the studio was nervous. But once filming started, Diaz stunned everyone with her natural charm and presence. Here's something interesting: Tina was originally supposed to be a femme fatale, a classic, seductive, and dangerous leading lady. But once Diaz was cast, they rewrote her character to be more warm, kind-hearted, and innocent. The change worked. Diaz's chemistry with Jim Carrey was electric, and their scenes together gave the film a heart that made it more than just a special effects showcase. Imagine if Diaz hadn't landed the role. Would the movie have been the same? Probably not. And to think, it almost didn't happen. Other actors almost played Stanley and Tina. It's hard to imagine anyone but Jim Carrey playing Stanley Ipkiss, but believe it or not, he wasn't the only actor considered for the role. New Line Cinema had a list of potential Stanleys, including Matthew Broderick, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Nicolas Cage, Face/Off, National Treasure, Rick Moranis, Ghostbusters, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Robin Williams, Mrs. Doubtfire, Aladdin, Martin Short, Three Amigos. Robin Williams would have been an interesting choice, considering his own cartoon-like energy, but can you imagine Nicolas Cage as Stanley? That would have been a very different movie. And what about Tina Carlisle? Well, before casting Cameron Diaz, the studio actually offered the role to Anna Nicole Smith. But she turned it down to star in Naked Gun 33 1/3 instead. Would The Mask have worked with a different Stanley and Tina? Maybe. But would it have become the classic we know today? Probably not. Sometimes, casting the right actors makes all the difference. The Cuban Pete scene was almost deleted. It's one of the most unforgettable moments in The Mask. Stanley Ipkiss, completely surrounded by cops, suddenly bursts into an over-the-top musical number, dancing and singing to Cuban Pete. The scene is so iconic now that it's hard to imagine The Mask without it. But guess what? The studio almost cut the entire scene. Why? The executives at New Line Cinema thought it was too long and unnecessary. They were worried that a full-blown song and dance number would slow the movie down. But director Chuck Russell fought to keep it, arguing that it perfectly fit the film's cartoon logic and Jim Carrey's insane energy. Luckily, they decided to test the scene with audiences first. And the reaction? People loved it. The audience couldn't stop laughing, and it became one of the most talked-about moments of the movie. Had the studio gone with their original plan, The Mask would have lost one of its most hilarious and unique sequences. Just imagine, no conga lines, no salsa moves, no Jim Carrey cha-cha-ing his way past cops. Sometimes, test audiences do make the right call. Cameron Diaz did not sing in the movie. Cameron Diaz's big breakout role in The Mask turned her into a Hollywood star overnight. But there's one thing about her performance that wasn't really her singing voice. Remember the sultry nightclub scene where Tina Carlisle performs "Gee Baby, Ain't I Good to You"? That wasn't Diaz singing. The voice you hear actually belongs to professional singer Susan Boyd. The reason? Cameron Diaz isn't much of a singer. The production team wanted Tina's performance to sound flawless, so they decided to use a trained vocalist instead. What's crazy is that many fans had no idea for years. Diaz lip-synced so well that it looked completely natural. It wasn't until much later that people started asking questions, and the truth came out. So, while Diaz completely owned the role of Tina, the one thing she didn't do was belt out that smooth, jazzy tune. But hey, if Marilyn Monroe and Audrey Hepburn both had their voices dubbed for musical numbers, Diaz is in good company. Jim Carrey learned to talk with giant teeth. Jim Carrey's crazy, oversized cartoon teeth in The Mask are one of the film's most recognizable features. But here's something surprising, those teeth were never meant to be used for talking. Originally, the huge prosthetic teeth were only supposed to be worn in silent scenes to give Carrey that exaggerated, animated look. The plan was to have him remove them when delivering lines. But Jim Carrey, being Jim Carrey, saw an opportunity. Instead of taking the easy route, he taught himself how to speak with the giant teeth still in his mouth. And not just speak, he delivered full-blown, hilarious dialogue without missing a beat. This decision completely changed the character. Instead of just looking like a cartoon, Stanley Ipkiss sounded like one, too. The muffled yet exaggerated way he spoke made the performance even funnier, turning what could have been a simple visual gag into one of the most iconic parts of the movie. Without Carrey's improvisation, The Mask might not have been as funny or memorable. Just another reason why Jim Carrey was perfect for this role. Milo improvised one of his most iconic scenes. Jim Carrey isn't the only one who brought spontaneous comedy to The Mask. His four-legged co-star, Milo, also had a moment of genius. In one particular scene, Stanley Ipkiss is desperately trying to hide stolen money in his closet when Milo unexpectedly jumps in and grabs a frisbee. What makes this moment special? It wasn't in the script. The original plan was for Jim Carrey to complete the scene without any interruptions from Milo. But as they were filming, the little Jack Russell Terrier decided to steal the spotlight, literally. He suddenly snatched a frisbee on his own, prompting Carrey to improvise his entire reaction on the spot. Instead of stopping the take, Carrey played along, turning the moment into a hilarious and completely natural exchange. The director loved it so much that he left it in the final cut. And honestly, could The Mask have worked without Milo's adorable antics? The little dog stole every scene he was in, proving that sometimes, the best moments in film aren't planned at all. The firehouse from Ghostbusters was used in The Mask. Ever feel like you've seen a location in a movie before? If Stanley's apartment garage in The Mask looks oddly familiar, there's a good reason for that. It's the exact same firehouse from Ghostbusters, 1984. That's right. The place where Stanley retrieves his car is actually the legendary Hook and Ladder 23, the very same building that served as the Ghostbusters headquarters. In Ghostbusters, this is where Egon, Venkman, and Ray stored their proton packs, battled ghosts, and answered calls to save New York City from supernatural chaos. By the time The Mask was filmed, the firehouse was no longer actively used, but Hollywood was still in love with it. Instead of constructing a brand new set, the production team decided to reuse the famous location. This isn't the only movie that has used the Ghostbusters firehouse, other productions have filmed there too. But unless you're looking closely, it's easy to miss. So, next time you watch The Mask, keep an eye out. You might just spot a piece of 1980s movie history hiding in plain sight. Did you notice all the pop culture references in The Mask? The Mask isn't just a comedy, it's a treasure trove of pop culture references, packed with hidden jokes and nods to famous moments in TV and film history. One of the most recognizable references? That's a spicy meatball. If that line sounds familiar, it's because it comes from a classic Alka-Seltzer commercial from the 1960s. In the ad, an actor keeps messing up his line after eating spicy food, eventually needing Alka-Seltzer to save his stomach. Jim Carrey perfectly mimics the over-the-top delivery, turning it into one of The Mask's funniest moments. Another iconic reference? You love me. You really love me. This line is a direct parody of Sally Field's Oscar acceptance speech from 1985. When she won her Academy Award, Field gave an emotional speech that has since become one of the most quoted moments in award show history. These references, and many others, helped make The Mask more than just a movie. It became a pop culture time capsule, packed with hilarious Easter eggs that fans are still discovering decades later. Did you know The Mask was nominated for an Oscar? And a Razzie? Yes, The Mask was so unique that it was recognized as both one of the best and worst films of the year, depending on who you asked. In 1995, the film was nominated for Best Visual Effects at the Academy Awards. And let's be honest, the CGI was groundbreaking at the time. From Stanley's wild transformations to The Mask's cartoonish antics, the film pushed the limits of digital effects in the early 90s. But despite the impressive work by Industrial Light and Magic, The Mask ended up losing to Forrest Gump, which wowed the Academy with its seamless blending of historical footage and digital trickery. But here's where it gets bizarre. Jim Carrey was also nominated for a Golden Globe for his performance, while at the same time, he received a Razzie nomination for Worst New Star. The Razzies singled him out for Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, not The Mask, but still, it's wild to think that in the same year, Carrey was seen as both a rising comedy genius and a Hollywood disaster. Jim Carrey based Stanley Ipkiss on his own father? Jim Carrey's performance in The Mask is pure cartoon energy, the exaggerated movements, the over-the-top expressions, the nervous yet lovable charm. But what if I told you that Stanley Ipkiss was actually based on a real person? That's right, Jim Carrey has revealed that his inspiration for Stanley came from his own father. According to Carrey, his dad was something of a real-life cartoon character. He had dramatic mannerisms, a big personality, and a natural comedic timing that made him both hilarious and endearing. Carrey grew up watching his father's quirks and expressions, unknowingly building the foundation for some of his most famous characters. So when it came time to play Stanley Ipkiss, a sweet but awkward guy who transforms into a larger-than-life persona, Carrey knew exactly how to bring him to life. This explains why Stanley feels so genuine and relatable, despite all the crazy things happening around him. Underneath the green mask and cartoon chaos, there's a real heart to the character, and that's likely because Carrey infused it with something personal. The Mask's iconic yellow suit was inspired by Carrey's first stand-up outfit. The bright yellow zoot suit that Stanley wears as the Mask is one of the film's most unforgettable visuals. It's loud, it's flashy, and it perfectly matches the character's larger-than-life personality. But here's a little-known fact, the outfit was actually inspired by Jim Carrey's very first stand-up performance. Before he became a Hollywood megastar, Carrey was just a young comedian trying to make a name for himself on stage. For his first ever stand-up gig, he wanted to wear something that would make him stand out. So, his mother, being incredibly supportive, handmade a yellow suit for him to wear. Years later, when The Mask was in production, Carrey suggested that the character should wear something similar, a nod to his own journey in comedy. The filmmakers loved the idea, and the bright yellow zoot suit became an iconic part of the movie's identity. So, every time you see The Mask swinging his cane and dancing in that flashy outfit, remember, it's not just a costume. It's a tribute to where Jim Carrey's career began. Here's your engaging, rewritten version, optimized for YouTube storytelling, with each section expanded to 200+ words. The Coco Bongo Club from The Mask is a real place. In The Mask, the Coco Bongo Club is the hottest spot in town, the place where Tina Carlisle mesmerizes the audience with her sultry performance and where Stanley Ipkiss, under the influence of The Mask, turns into a wild, dancing showman. But here's something surprising, Coco Bongo isn't just a movie set, it's a real nightclub. Located in Cancun, Mexico, Coco Bongo is one of the most famous nightclubs in the world, known for its extravagant Las Vegas-style performances, aerial dancers, and massive party atmosphere. The club was already a big attraction before the movie, but after The Mask came out, it became a must-visit destination for fans. People from all over the world now flock to Coco Bongo, expecting the same kind of over-the-top entertainment they saw in the film. And while you might not see Jim Carrey belting out Cuban Pete, you will experience a night of wild performances, flying acrobats, and confetti explosions, just like the movie promised. Jim Carrey turned down $10 million for The Mask 2. After The Mask became a massive hit, New Line Cinema was desperate for a sequel. And they were willing to pay big money to make it happen. Jim Carrey was offered a staggering $10 million to reprise his role as Stanley Ipkiss. But to everyone's shock, he turned it down. Why? Carrey didn't want to get trapped in sequels. After doing Ace Ventura, When Nature Calls, he realized that he didn't enjoy repeating himself. He was an actor who thrived on new challenges, and he feared that doing The Mask 2 would limit his creativity. So, despite the massive paycheck, he walked away. For New Line Cinema, this was a nightmare. They had a franchise-ready movie, but no Jim Carrey to carry it. For years, they tried to figure out a way to bring The Mask back without him. And when they finally did, well, it didn't go as planned. When Jim Carrey said no, Son of the Mask became a disaster. Since Jim Carrey refused to return, New Line Cinema still went ahead and made a sequel, and it was an absolute train wreck. Released in 2005, Son of the Mask starred Jamie Kennedy as the unlucky guy who ends up with the cursed artifact. But without Carrey's charismatic performance, comic timing, and cartoon-like energy, the movie completely flopped. The special effects? Overdone and creepy. The humor? Painfully unfunny. The story? A mess from start to finish. Audiences hated it, critics shredded it, and it bombed at the box office, earning just $59 million worldwide, barely covering its budget. And the worst part? Son of the Mask is now considered one of the worst sequels ever made. It has an astonishingly low rating on almost every movie review site and has become a prime example of how not to make a follow-up film. In the end, Jim Carrey's decision to walk away looks even smarter. Without him, The Mask was never the same, and Hollywood learned the hard way that some movies should never get a sequel. Jim Carrey would only return for The Mask 2 under one condition. For years, fans have been begging for The Mask 2 with Jim Carrey back in the lead role. And in 2020, Carrey finally gave an answer, but it wasn't the one people expected. Carrey said that he'd only consider returning if a crazy visionary filmmaker was behind the project. In other words, it couldn't just be a cash grab sequel. It had to be something bold, fresh, and completely unique, something that pushed the boundaries of comedy and visual effects, just like the original did in 1994. So, who qualifies as a crazy visionary? Fans immediately started speculating. Could it be Taika Waititi, known for his wacky, high-energy style? Or maybe Guillermo del Toro, who could bring a darker, more surreal take on the character? What about Edgar Wright, the master of fast-paced, stylish comedy? For now, Carrey hasn't said yes, but he hasn't said no either. If the right director steps in, The Mask could make a comeback, and with today's technology, imagine what they could do. Would you want to see Jim Carrey return as Stanley Ipkiss? And more importantly, who do you think should direct it? Did you know The Mask had an animated series? With a crazy crossover? After the massive success of The Mask, Hollywood wasn't ready to let go of Stanley Ipkiss just yet. So, in 1995, The Mask animated series hit TV screens, bringing back the wild, over-the-top adventures of the green-faced trickster. The show ran for 3 seasons, airing a total of 54 episodes from 1995 to 1997. It kept the same wacky humor and cartoon logic as the movie, complete with absurd transformations, slapstick chaos, and zany villains. While Jim Carrey didn't return to voice Stanley, the character's spirit stayed alive through Rob Paulsen, a veteran voice actor known for Animaniacs and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But the craziest part? The final episode of the series featured a crossover with Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. That's right, Stanley Ipkiss and Ace Ventura, both originally played by Jim Carrey, ended up in the same animated universe. Seeing the two eccentric characters interact was a dream come true for Carrey fans, even if it was just in animated form. While The Mask never got a proper live-action sequel with Carrey, this show kept the spirit of the movie alive for years after its release. If you grew up in the 90s, chances are, this version of The Mask was a big part of your childhood. So, let's think about this for a second. If The Mask had stayed a horror film, would it still have been a hit? If Jim Carrey had turned it down, would would we even remember this movie today? And what if the studio had actually gone ahead with a proper sequel instead of Son of the Mask? Could we have gotten The Mask 2 with Carrey in the lead? One thing's for sure, this movie was lightning in a bottle. Everything had to fall into place perfectly for it to become the comedy classic we know today. So now, I want to hear from you. Would you have watched The Mask as a horror movie? And if Jim Carrey ever came back for a sequel, who do you think should direct it? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more behind-the-scenes Hollywood secrets. Thanks for watching.